This is the comic I'm holding on the cover.
So when you agreed to do this, did you have any idea that it would turn out to be what it actually became?
Nobody did.
Welcome to the Dummy Show. I'm John Kelly, publisher of Dummy, which you can find at dummyzine.com. That's dummyzine.com. In today's episode, we look at I Like Comics, an amazing 1993 zine that chronicles all of the amazing alternative cartoonist activity that was going on in Seattle at that time. I speak with the editors, Peter Bagge and Helena Harvilicz, art director, Pat Moriarty, and even cover model, Bruce Chrislip, about how it all came together. As you'll see in the episode, all of the artwork, the production artwork for I Like Comics 30 years later, still exists and is in good shape. I would like to recreate the original I Like Comics, but not as the way that it appeared 30 years ago. I would like to publish it as the production art pages, complete with the printer's notes and markups and everything, so that you would get a sense of what it actually was like to print a zine at that time. During my interview with Pete, we also talked at length about the 1993 Hateball tour that he did with fellow cartoonist Dan Clowes. They went across the country to small comic book shops to meet fans and to sell copies of their very popular comic books at the time, Hate and 8 Ball. And you can also get Dummy's authorized recreation of the t-shirt that was sold on the Hateball tour 30 years ago at dummyzine.com. And we'll talk about all of that in an upcoming episode of The Dummy Show. For now, let's look at I Like Comics on The Dummy Show.
Peter Bagge told me at the time that this was sort of an alternative to the Comics Journal, because a lot of people felt the Comics Journal was, let's say, becoming a little pretentious. So this was an attempt to do something a little more down to earth.
How did I Like Comics come about? Like, how did this whole start?
I don't recall exactly what the seed for the idea was, except that I do believe I was thinking I myself would like to do a fanzine about comics. Just make a that was the era of zines. There's tons of zines coming out of all types. Some were a bit comic related. I wanted to do one that was comic related, but also specifically about the type of art and artists that I liked. And at that time, I think Helena Harvilicz was pretty new to Seattle. She moved there to work for Fantagraphics, but she and I hit it off really well. It's one of the funniest people I ever met, for one thing.
Sure.
And she had a similar idea. I think that's how we wound up deciding to do it together. Is she also was thinking of doing the same thing, so we did it together.
Why don't you walk us through how this all came about?
Wow. So I had been the managing editor of the Comics Journal. Um, and then I left there because I kind of had a falling out with Gary Groth. I almost kind of regretted it, but um, and it was hard working there for me, although I really loved it. And I still stayed in touch with people there, including Pete. And then Pete said, "Oh, well, let's do our own comic about comics, or let's do our own magazine about comics." And I wanted to do that because I really liked being the editor of the Comics Journal, the managing editor. So and I also kind of shared Peter Bagge's kind of more playful attitude toward that kind of thing. So when he asked me, I was, you know, totally on board. I think he had originally wanted to call it "Let's Get It On," which was which was a good idea, but he settled on "I Like Comics," and I thought that was a great title.
If it had been called "Let's Get It On" with that picture, that photo of Bruce Chrislip on the cover, it would have maybe had a different reaction. But "I Like Comics" is the perfect title for that image.
And another person that also got very involved, Pat Moriarty did all the production on it. He's a professional art director, and he very much used the facilities at Fantagraphics.
I was surprised to hear from you about it, and I had to like look around. Like, I think I still have the layouts to that thing around here somewhere. And so you put me on the search, and I found it pretty easily, actually.
That's wonderful news. And as I in some ways was joking around a little bit about it, but in other ways I'm actually not. I think it would be extremely interesting to do something where there's a reproduction of your original layouts and mechanicals, and just to run them as they are with the markups on them, and printer's notes and everything, and then intersperse that with people's memories about what it is. That would be, it'd be a different thing than what we're doing now in this video that I'm doing, but having a physical object that reproduces it and shows these generations of fans and artists themselves that this is exactly how something was done.
Yeah, this was all like kind of almost pre-internet, but it's like, yeah, I found all the pages, and they're physical pieces, and all the color separations or grays had to be cut with the rubylith and an X-Acto knife. This is film.
Yeah.
And then at the top, you're right, like I write 10% screen, and just notes. It's like it's making me think about how it's a lost art form. I feel like I have a lot of obsolete skills that, even marveling at these key lines, as they're called, I was just like, the careful pasting together and using wax and a roller and X-Acto knives and whiteout, and it's yeah, it's a lost art form. And then also Pete lovingly hand lettered all of this is all like his hand lettering, and so that kind of, like, I thought gave the thing a kind of a common vibe. It's like just really good lettering. Pete's just natural lettering is real easy to read and cartoony, and he like boldens the right words in the right places and all that kind of stuff. It's like kind of gave it a graphic design vibe, even though it was really decidedly quick and low budget and homespun. I think I put this all together at home in my bedroom studio desk, and I think I might have waxed everything at Fantagraphics and then brought it home and put it all together on 8.5 by 11 paper, and it's all put together with Xeroxes. I don't think there's a couple of PMT stats in there, but those were mostly ads. All the rest of it's all like Xerox, I think.
That's something else I have to say too is it'd been a long time since I self-published. I self-published some stuff with friends in the early 80s. Really hated dealing on my own with printers and distributors. And thankfully, Kim Thompson of Fantagraphics said they'd take care of that. They basically treated it like a Fantagraphics title. They sent it to their usual printer, and they dealt with their usual distributors. So that made things really easy. So even though officially it's self-published, uh, I wouldn't say we couldn't have done it without Fantagraphics, but they made it so much easier.
There's a lot of presence of Fantagraphics throughout the book.
Yes.
I
And we're
think
promoting a lot of their artists, so
sure. I think Helena had been the editor of the Comics Journals. I believe she was my first editor at the Comics Journal, although I'm not certain that I actually wrote anything.
if I'm remembering correctly, I loved her stint, as short as it was, as the managing editor of the journal. Because again, it was like part of the reason I love the idea of working with her. She's very irreverent. She's very wacky and doesn't even though she's a fan of comics like me, she didn't treat it like a religion, didn't approach it in this reverential way, quite the opposite. And that tend to come through with the issues of the Comics Journal that she edited. There was like this wacky, not I don't mean this to sound at all derogatory, but it was like a fangirl attitude and aesthetic, almost like it's same with I like comics. It's almost like Tiger Beat magazine. You know what I
Sure,
mean?
sure,
You
sure.
know. So like I keep saying, irreverent is the key word.
He knew. I didn't know Bruce so well, but Peter did, and he thought he would be great for the cover. And that whole drawing the body was kind of based on these teen magazines that they used to have, and he was kind of I think there was a centerfold with him also, wasn't it?
There was. He's like surrounded by comic books. He's laying on a bed of comic looking very sexy. Yes.
And there's a centerfold in this thing where Pete had me stretched out on a bed of comics. Some of these comics are from my collection, some from Pete. I really remember quite well doing the photo shoot with Pete, because he just told me what he was going to do and all. And we took lots of photos,
Who was the photographer?
Pete.
Oh,
Pete Bagge. Yeah, no, this is a low budget operation.
okay. You didn't have to fly in anybody from Manhattan or anything.
He didn't who's the guy that did the famous Beatles pose? Richard Avedon. No, he didn't bring him in or anything like that. No.
Was the idea from the beginning to work with just cartoonists that you knew? Did they have to be from the Seattle area?
Yeah, well, that made it a lot easier when it came to who we were going to interview. I think a couple of the interviews I did by myself, and a few I did with Helena. And I believe did Helena interview her roommates? She was living at this wacky down house.
Crab and JR and
Yeah, and Pat Moriarty. They all lived in the same house. Later on, Eric Reynolds moved in. Al Columbia lived there for a while. It was like this it was like this revolving door of cartoonists. And of course, the place was a dump. The rent was very cheap.
yeah.
It was Helena had just interviewed her roommates. But other than that, it seemed like, well, if we want to do face-to-face interviews, this town suddenly had a lot of really talented cartoonists living here. So let's just interview the people who are living here. And also at that time, Julie Desay just moved here. I don't think she lived here for very long, a year or two, but it was during her stint in Seattle that we interviewed her face to face.
What I really love about I Like Comics is that it's very irreverent and extremely funny. And it's also one of these things that at the time that it came out, it was just like, oh, this is a hoot and everything. But now, more than 30 years later, it's an incredible snapshot of an era. Maybe not just for comics at the time, but also for Seattle at the time. Seattle's a very different place than it was in 1992, 93.
Right. And it was at that time it was changing drastically and very quickly from what it was. So Probably because of Fantagraphics and the overall raising of the profile of indie comics. All of a sudden, at that time, right at those very years, 1993, 94, 95, a lot of cartoonists from all over the country moved to Seattle. But then, surprisingly, an awful lot of them moved away. A lot of them didn't stick around very long. And all of a sudden, Brooklyn seemed like it became the Mecca. Brooklyn and maybe to a lesser extent, Portland, Oregon. But all of a sudden, those two cities became much more centers of alternative comic art. Brooklyn got ridiculously crowded. You couldn't throw a rock without hitting a cartoonist in Williamsburg at a certain point. And Seattle was a bit like that for a while, but then maybe because the rents suddenly just skyrocketed around that time over the course of the 80s. Because when I moved here, Seattle was cheap. Like you're talking, like I'm sure when you moved to Pittsburgh, you were shocked at how cheap it was compared
Oh,
to New
sure.
York. And it still is relatively cheap, but Seattle was you can get a one-bedroom apartment for $200 when I moved here.
Right.
And but then the cost of living here just skyrocketed.
Remember, I think the postcards might have been my idea, but I don't recall. I thought that was kind of fun. We sent people the postcards, and they would do a drawing. And because Peter's name was attached to it, we got a lot of um, responses to that.
No, you got a lot of big names responding and doing sketches. It's funny. It's almost like a letters page in a way for a magazine that it's the first issue. It was the only issue of it, and yet you have these endorsements and reactions from people who would be famous to the readers of the publication. So I thought and like the rest of the magazine, there was all very fun and playful and very funny too.
Right. Yeah, that was important to me. I always wanted the Comics Journal to be more playful. And I would suggest things to Gary, and sometimes we would do them like the feature where someone would it was called Hey Kids Comics, where they would do a strip. Like that was my idea. I just wanted something that was more uh like I said, more funny, more, fun, playful. Uh, so this was an opportunity for me to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, I mean it's filled with it's filled with the traditional things that a comics zine would have. So there's reflections on different um, artists and cartoonists, um, and there's lots of interviews. There's lots of great interviews, but the interviews are very funny, and they're done in a way that you wouldn't see necessarily in the Comics Journal. They're in some ways more candid, um, and playful. So it really captures the essence of the people, I think, in ways that more formal publications usually don't. So that's one of the
Right.
reasons why it's so great.
Well, a lot of the artists were irritated by those postcards because they were just regular USPS postcards that already have the postage on them. And some people were angry that the paper was not good to draw on. And they were like, why did you send, because they would sometimes mail the back in an envelope. Like I just thought they would just stick it right in the mail. Why did you send me this crappy postcard and now the ink's running and things like that? But
They didn't want their art to get touched and mangled, maybe.
that's what I wanted. I thought, because mail art was kind of a thing back then too, right?
Like I was doing zines at the time, prior to that and right up until around that point. So I would get postcards from people who were, some of the people that you printed postcards of in the issue. I received postcards on a regular basis from those people. If I had sent them my zine, they would send a little postcard back with a sketch on it. And I don't even know if I have all of them. I, want to kill myself for some of the ones that I got that I don't know where they are at this point after all the moves that I've had
Yeah.
over the years. But it was something that was done at the time. It's hard to envision that today,
Yeah.
especially for younger people, like people the age of our kids. The thought that the thought that you would actually send a letter to somebody is bizarre, right? But to actually send a drawing written on a piece of paper and mailing it as a almost not performance art, but it's a work of art in itself, which mail art, you're right, it was a thing in those days still.
Oh, I think Crumb was in there, if I'm not mistaken. There were, in terms of, giving us a postcard there. I'm trying to remember who else the big
Eagleman
names.
was Eagleman gave you one.
Yeah.
uh, Drew Friedman, Jaime, a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
really great to go through and very.
Yeah. That was all, but that had nothing to do with me. That's because Peter was attached to it. But yeah, I had the originals. I gave them to Jeff Wong. I don't know if you're familiar with him, because
Yeah.
when I moved to New York, he let me stay with him, and I was like, here, you can have these because I'll just lose them anyway. So he's very excited to get them.
Oh, I would have been very excited. So do you remember how many copies were printed up of this?
A decent amount. I think we printed up 6,000. Could originally, again, since Kim Thompson was dealing with the distribution, I think he said, well, let's print up 3 or 4,000. And I said, well, what if it sells out? And Kim was like, I do not want to go through the trouble of reprinting. This is a one and done. So I think I managed to talk him into printing up at least 5 or 6,000. And it all sold out pretty quick. It did surprisingly well.
Does the production art still exist somewhere?
If it does, I would imagine that Pat Moriarty has it. He probably would have the boards for it, because he was one that laid the whole thing out. And I don't know who. Helena probably did the typesetting. Somebody knew how to type to do all that typesetting, and that was again. This was all analog. This is totally pre-digital.
Sure.
So yeah, so they had a typesetting machine. So you had to go through the whole thing of cutting out the strips and using the that glue to lay everything out.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
very much the old-fashioned days.
Pasting it up on boards and
Yes, stuff that like when I talk to somebody who's, especially if they're, millennials, Gen Z, they don't know what I'm talking about when I explain how you had to do things before Photoshop, color separations. Yeah, I befriended a young cartoonist who's from down here in Tacoma, and I was showing him and a friend old-fashioned Rubylith layouts, and they were just like, and this turns into color. They could not get their heads around it at all, and
Yeah.
and I'm like, you buy an old comic before 1994, 1995, they were all colored this way. A handful might have been hand colored, but yeah, this is somebody had to do all of this.
Again, getting back to like how this all came about, did you decide that you wanted to work with Helena to do this because of her experience at the Comics Journal?
Well, there's that. Yeah, she knew what she was doing, and we both. She might have a different story, but from what I remember, I think we both had the same idea. What we both had in mind for a comic fanzine was very similar, so it seemed only natural that we would just combine forces. And then later on, since neither of us were had the real skills as an art director that Pat Moriarty did, he volunteered his services to lay the whole thing out, which was a lot of work on his part.
It was.
I'm surprised I even kept this stuff because I don't think anybody at the time was thinking of this as anything other than another cool zine to put out, but that like it would be like need to be archived or hung on to years later. I just stuck it all in an envelope and forgot about it. That's basically the only reason it's around. And a lot of it is just real like yes, this is the layout of it with for the center spread, and FPO stands for position only. And
Right.
so I got Xeroxes of there's a photo here of Bruce, and this is another photo And then I sent the real photos with the percentages on them in order to make them fit. This is a Xerox of the Fantagraphics offices in Lake, on Lake Street there.
Like City.
And yeah, I think Pete and Helena and I'm not sure who else, Frank Young maybe, all like wrote little captions on there. Gary's office, and then aim the bomb here for where his office is. And then I see over here someone wrote Pat Moriarty, that's where I worked. And it says, I hate my job. Wow. I bet Pete did that. But just kind of this beat up old place. But I'm not sure. I haven't been there in a while, but I'm sure it's the same location.
It is. I was there.
Artifact.
I was there the first time with Pete a couple of years before I Like Comics came out. And then,
Oh, so you kind of saw the vibe there.
I'm sorry?
You kind of saw the vibe of the place back in those days then.
Absolutely. But then when we were in Seattle in 2023 to get married, we went back. I went back to the offices. Tammy had never been there before, obviously. And
What's the vibe there now?
it's the same thing. It's exactly the same. There's shit all over the place. It's just, people working. It's Gary was there and Eric was there, and there's, there's chaos, but it's awesome.
Yeah, it was kind of like reminded me of like a clubhouse that with a bunch of working creatives inside. And it's like in the 90s, one of the bedrooms was a dark room. So it was full of photochemicals, and it had a big stat camera, and you close the door and shut the lights off and shoot stats. And then in the work area, they had a big typesetting machine that would spit out columns, like these long scrolls of columns of text for the comics journal. And then we had laundry lines going across the art department and our clothespins, and we hung all of the text all over the place to dry out. So it looked like a laundry room in there with the stats and typeset copy and everything all hanging from everywhere. And then we would take it off and run it through the waxer, and then cut the columns up into chunks, and then turn on the light table and paste everything down. And so like that was the vibe back then with the I guess the technology has certainly improved a bit.
Well,
we could eventually get into using computers.
It's definitely changed, right? And
Yeah.
I think it stands as an artifact in that I don't, it's something that used that old technology for color separations, and it's so obvious by looking at the issue that it was done that way because of the colors that are used on the cover and everything.
Yeah. These methods have changed so much.
They have, but it's one thing to try to explain to somebody who's generations younger than us how things were done. Looking at those mechanicals in production art, though, you can actually, it makes sense. It's like this is exactly how it was done, right?
I mostly did the fun stuff, and I guess Helena and I just talked about who we wanted to feature, what people we wanted to interview. And again, I don't recall any disagreements. Like I'm looking at the cover, Julie Doucet, Michael Dugan, Jim Woodring, Denny Icorn, Gary Groth, Helena's roommates, Pat and Bob Crab and Jer. We both were in total agreement about all of them. And again, they were all here in Seattle. So what could be easier? So we just either by ourselves, either like with a couple of them, I did it by myself, or with Helena, we just arranged meetings with everybody and recorded interviews.
Sure. But speaking of the cover, though, I mean, the cover is very iconic, and why did you go into how that came about? How did you end up using Bruce Chrislip on the
Well,
cover?
and Bruce understands this. It's like Bruce, you've met him. He looks like a quintessential comic nerd. He just so much looks the part, and he likes comics. It's almost like he's in them. He was living in Seattle at the time as well, so he was like this human embodiment of somebody that you would picture liking comics. He was an archetype. So I asked him, "Would you pose?" And pose like a centerfold, just surrounded by comics. And he was like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" He thought it was funny.
This is the comic I'm holding on the cover.
Wow, that's the same. That's the same copy of the
Oh,
comic.
this is it. Yeah, this was I don't know if you could. It's a Mad knockoff by Charlton from the mid 1950s called A.
Yeah.
Dig This Crazy Comic. And when I first bought this, I didn't understand what the comic was. This attractive woman walking by and these two carpenter type guys saying she sure is. I thought, well, what's that mean? But if you look in the background, there's a brick outhouse. So it's a saying she's built like a brick outhouse or worse. This is the shirt I was wearing.
Wow.
The Cheese House, New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. On the
Wow.
background, it says, I don't know if you can see it. You've got a friend in cheeses. Yeah, yeah, it's
So that stuff should either go to Billy Ireland, or if nothing else, the dummy archives one day.
well, maybe, maybe. I got to tell you that I don't understand the enduring impact of this thing. I mean, they didn't print that many. I think it was less than 5,000 copies, but I saw it. I remember when it came out, it felt very strange for me to walk into a comic book shop in Seattle and see my face staring back at me from the racks.
And then not that long ago, Owen Klein had it in his film.
That's right, briefly. And it's funny, he sort of like blanked out my face a little bit, because I didn't know anything about it until the movie was out.
But it was a real education working at Fantagraphics in the 90s. It was a real interesting time to be around there. And in those days, artists would send their original artwork to the office instead of digital files. So, because we would shoot them in the darkroom or, whatever. And so I got a lot of firsthand viewing up close of people's art. And I got to see like where they would paste a panel over another panel because they changed their mind somewhere, or what kind of paper they used, or how clean the artwork was, or how labored and white outed it was, and who used blue pencils and who didn't, and what size of piece of paper did that artist really draw that on. Like Drew Friedman used to draw really small, and those really detailed drawings that really surprised me. And then there'd be other artists that drew gigantically, where you just couldn't believe how is it even necessary to draw this big. And so that was a real education. And then meeting a lot of different artists that came through the doors there, Bern Hogarth and Robert Crumb, and just that's how I met Sherry Flanagan, and that was a real education. It was like more education to work there than it was to go to college, I think, about art.
Oh, I'm
And
sure.
And yeah, and I always just like old 16 magazines. I did it. I tried to recreate it with one of the issues of Hate number 3, where I deliberately tried to make it look like a 16 magazine or a Tiger Beat. I always loved when they would take photographs of somebody, like it'd be like the monkeys, and make cartoon bodies.
Yeah.
I always loved that look. I did that with the band I was in with Dan Klaus. that at least I think at one point I thought about doing that with everybody, but that seemed like it would have been a bit too daunting to get a good. You had to screen the photograph back then too. It had to turn it into little dots. That was always a pain in the ass to reproduce a photo. So I didn't want to do that with all of this. So I just wound up just hand drawing everything like that. Yeah, I remember getting a lot of compliments for this cover when it came out. I remember Klaus saying that cover has so much energy. It was like, oh, well, thanks. And but I think that it reflected the whole magazine. I thought the whole thing had a lot of energy in it, you know.
Well, it just says everything, it really does. It captures that old school technology or whatever technology there was there. You could see it on
Right.
the cover. It's got all of these names on it. It's got this crazy image of this grinning guy holding a comic book, so happy,
He's so happy.
so happy. And I
Holding an
like
old
it's
EC
just,
cone.
it's just so I like comics.
Yeah.
It's um how did was that always going to be the title, or it's almost
Yeah, I don't remember any other title being seriously considered. I think I suggested it. Helena said that was perfect. Again, she might have different memories um, of how that all came about, but and I won't dispute anything that she might remember. But yeah, I think it was a perfect description of what it was all about. So quite literal. You know.
yeah. I think the interview you did with Gary Groth is fascinating and hilarious, and you dig down in ways that you get them to open up and talk about things that few people have, I think. And it's
That of all the interviews, that was the one that did get the most commentary. I remember a lot of people telling me that they found that interview with Gary Groth fascinating. I guess for that reason, it showed a different side of him. Usually he's the one doing the interviewing. I don't know if anybody else has ever interviewed him up to that point. So got to turn the tables on him.
yeah,
But but yeah, I remember I haven't read these interviews since this came out. I haven't reread this at all. Maybe I'll just flip through it. The one thing that I love, I gotta say, my favorite thing is uh, I wrote an introduction at the beginning, my little editorial, and then Helena's editorial. I thought was the funniest thing in the magazine. Her brief
yeah.
little thing, just talking about to get attention, she would hide under the family's coffee table, and then she realized hiding wasn't the best way to get attention. But yeah, that was just hilarious.
No, she's a very funny writer, and
Yeah.
I wish she was doing more of it. I mean,
Yeah. Well, she was a funny person, just hanging out with her and talking to her. She was a scream.
there was no one like her.
Yeah.
There was a ton of funny pieces in I Like Comics, but I think one of the best was when you interviewed your roommates, the guys that you were living with at the time. That interview with everyone was absolutely hilarious. It's just I don't know if the movie Slacker had come out yet at that point, but it does capture the zeitgeist of the times. You a bunch of young talented people living together in a probably crappy house, and paying, I would hope, very little rent to do so. You made it seem like a lot of fun, at least, even though
Yeah.
it was probably chaotic.
We were all pretty tolerant of each other. So that was, I we were all just kind of messy and just kind of, you know, yeah, there wasn't any, what can mess up living situations like that is when you have somebody that's kind of uptight, right? Is going to complain about dishes in the sink and stuff like that. And we weren't really that bad, but nobody really cared too much about that stuff. Yeah, that house was fun. It was a lot of fun and it was very easy. Everyone there was pretty relaxed, and it was great. I had to, I moved in there with Pat at first, Pat Moriarty, because I had been kicked out of the other house that I lived in for having sex too loudly. They were more relaxed over at the other place.
Yeah, they were okay with that at the other place.
They just didn't seem nobody seemed to care about stuff like that. We used to
Yeah,
have some wild parties. We had some crazy parties. I remember had this big hat. And I got really drunk and lit it on fire and threw it out the window.
What about,
I'm
do you
glad.
remember any thoughts about the Jim Woodring interview? I really like that one an awful lot too.
Yeah. Well, I knew that he would make for a great subject. He's a great storyteller. He's a great raconteur, and I think both me and Helena visited him for that interview. And yeah, we just knew that that would be very entertaining. Again, he has a real way with words. He speaks in like one of my favorite. As much as I love his artwork, uh, when an issue of Jim would come out, I just loved his random writings. The way he would write editorials, he just had this really colorful, over the top, yet old fashioned way of speaking that came really naturally to him. And he would all in person, he would often speak that way.
And then he goes to pantomime.
He goes to what?
He's
Oh yeah, oh right.
the pantomime,
Yeah, I know. I was as we were talking about this, that's exactly what I was thinking. This man with a way of words all of a sudden starts making wordless comics.
which is so in keeping with such a him being such an interesting person.
Right, yes.
There may be a newer generation of people who would be interested in a reprint of this too. I don't know if
Oh, well,
it's even possible.
well, the thing is, I keep waiting for a new generation to come up who would embrace and fall in love with these comics from this era, from the 80s and 90s. I keep waiting for every now and then you'll meet somebody. Do you know Owen Klein?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, someone like him. It's like, why aren't there more Owen Kleins? Or this young artist I know, well, he lives in Seattle now, but he's from Tacoma, a guy named Ian Wheelock, a really good artist. And it's like, and he collects t-shirts. And every time I see him, I'm looking at him and it's like, is that a Murph the Surf t-shirt? And he's like, yeah. And I go, so you know who Murph the Surf? He goes, oh yeah, of course. I love Rick Griffin. It's like in your 20s, it's like I so wish I could clone you. People like that that's so rare. What's strange though is like let's say in the 60s, there's a whole generation of people who totally embraced, the Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden they were like bigger than ever, even though W.C. Fields was dead, but he was more popular than ever. He became this icon in death
Yeah.
by a generation that probably never saw anything by him, until years later. I guess they discovered all their movies at revival houses. But
Yeah.
it'd be nice if something like that would happen with not even comics from the 80s and 90s, but even just all the underground stuff, going all the way back to the late 60s.
Yeah, I think on a certain level it's happening. And I think there's a nostalgia among the younger comics fans for at least for some of them. I talk to them when I'm at these festivals, and it's an interesting thing because it's, to me, 1990, this came out in 1993, right? To me, that seems like not long ago at all, right?
Yeah, but it is.
I know it is, but it seems like, well, oh, that wasn't, think about it like, oh, that's not very old. That's from the
Sure.
90s. That's not old at all, right?
Yes.
I think of those terms, but if you think about what, like, say, Happy Days, right? When
Right.
that came out, that was looking at an era that was only like 20
Not even 20
ago.
years.
Yeah,
Not
so
even
it was
20
like
years.
looking at
Yeah.
it was like looking at 2006 or something like that.
It's-
If it was being done today,
yeah. Yeah.
which,
Well, I have to tell you real quickly, that reminds me, in the late 70s, I briefly attended School of Visual Arts. So I visited and this very old aunt of mine, not long for this world. And she said, so where the school you're going to, where is it? I go, it's in New York City. And she goes, where in New York City? And I told her it's like 3rd Avenue, and they have 2 buildings on 23rd and 21st. And she went, 21st and 3rd. She was, we used to live there. I lived there. I go, when was that? And she went, oh, 1904. Yeah, 1904. Okay. But she said it to her. That was like yesterday, Wasn't that long ago?
Can you hold up some of the production art?
I'm sure. Um, I've got the They Like Comics 2 layouts, and these are all just Xeroxes of cartoons that people sent in. And there's the Gary Groth spread. It's just at a 8.5 by 14, or I don't know, maybe it's 11 by 17. A piece of paper with the spread on it. That's like tape on the bottom. That's 4 halftones of Gary and a couple Xeroxes of some Pete's cartoons. What else have I got here? Here's the Jim Woodring spread. That's just Xeroxes and Pete's beautiful hand lettering, And then I glued a picture of Jim's face on there. One thing I noticed is that all the page numbers are different from different magazines. So like, I don't think there's any 2 page numbers that are alike. See, that's a real small one. I just noticed that today. Then there's the crab pot spread. And so Pete lettered all of that, and it's just like on like typing paper or something, but it's really good lettering. And then that photograph of us all sitting on the couch reading comic books, and then Pete drew those little thought balloons above each head. Weed, sex, and Star Trek.
Did he draw those onto the boards?
Yeah, this is just like cheap 8.5 by or 11 by 17 paper or whatever, and then he just lettered it right on that cheap paper, and then this is really cheaply made. What this might be is, if I look at it close, is a printout of all the text, and then the rest of it was blank, and then he lettered that on, and then I glued the photo on there. These Mary Fleener spot illos all over her interview, and those are all individually cut out and glued in place. I'm surprised none of that. This stuff isn't as beat up looking as I thought it would be. It's more of the I Like Comics too. Morty the dog. Looks like an R. Crumb postcard.
So are those Xeroxes of the postcards that are
Yeah.
pasted down?
Yeah. I think I've got every single page of this magazine, except there's a few missing pages because I was looking at the page numbers, and I think those were probably ads. But I've got like the inside front cover is an old comic of mine, and then I've got Pete's editorial and Helena's editorial.
Yeah, those are hilarious.
And the contents page, and you can see the blue pencil underneath. It's just like this is all just glued together. Yeah, I mean, like the whole thing is right there, except for the spreads. That's the whole thing. It's all 8.5 by 11 pages.
But yeah, I spent some time rereading some of the interviews in there today, and it is a real snapshot of 1993 Seattle. Things were building.
We were there in 2023, and it's still wonderful. I mean, I would move there in a second if it wasn't so expensive.
It's funny, in here there's an interview with Denny Eichhorn, and this is 1993, and he's already talking about how they've ruined Seattle. Too many people have moved there. My wife says they were talking that way going back to at least the 1950s.
Have you ever regretted doing this?
No,
No.
it was a fun kind of fame. So no, I don't.
I see you at some of those cons and you're wearing the I Like Comics t-shirt.
Yeah, see, I'm not ashamed of it or anything.